of Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and as always, it is an honor to be able to rise in this place. And tonight I rise and would like to begin my remarks by passing along from Danielle and myself, on behalf of the people of Battle River Crowfoot, condolences to Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, and Nick, the entire Mulroney family, on the passing of Brian Mulroney, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada. Madam Speaker, when reflecting after learning of Mr. Mulroney's passing, I am of a generation where I did not have the chance to, although was alive for a few short years of his latter years in office, I did not have a chance to experience firsthand the leadership that he provided to our country. I did, however, in reflection, come to realize how consequential, and we've heard a lot tonight about how impactful his legacy was and is in the country that we know and love today. And things that when I was reflecting back in reading my social studies textbooks, where things were taken for granted, things like free trade, things like the fact that CFCs damaged the ozone layer, and things like the need to stand up for what's right, and that Canada could play a consequential role in challenging policies like apartheid in South Africa. And to see, and it's having looked at that image many times over the past number of weeks, of the three great conservative leaders that dominated so much of those formative years that saw the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. President Ronald Reagan, UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and of course Canada's own Brian Mulroney. The impact and the legacy to which his leadership led this country from challenging years, challenging decades of policies that held Canada back, to a renewed hope and optimism. And that's what I'll touch on here briefly, Madam Speaker. Shortly after the world learned of Mr. Mulroney's passing, I received a text message from a constituent, and it was interesting, his reflections, saying that he remembers back to that 1983 convention. He was there, and his family was involved in politics at that time. He was a much younger man at that point in time. But he reflected to me how much hope Brian Mulroney's leadership victory at that convention gave to him for Alberta's place in Canada and for the future and the potential that existed in our country. And Madam Speaker, it's consequential, and the reason why I bring that up here this evening is because that hope and that promise of what Canada is and what Canada can be is so key, and I think such a significant part of the legacy of the late Prime Minister. Madam Speaker, I would also share, after learning of Brian Mulroney's passing, I reached out to one of my predecessors, Honourable Malone, who served for a number of years prior to the 1984 election, and then for the two majority governments, and notably as a member of and chair of the Defence Committee. And I reached out and introduced myself, though we shared a region and many constituents. He had since moved away from Battle River Crowfoot, but I asked for if he had any thoughts and reflections. And Madam Speaker, I would like to share a couple of those with you and this House and to a grateful nation. And I would just reference, and I'll quote a poem here in a moment, but what struck me from the stories that both Mr. Malone shared with me about his experience as part of the Mulroney government over two successive majorities, it came back to people. One of the stories that was shared with me, Madam Speaker, is an example of Brian's kindness. This is what Arnold Malone had to say. was that he was with a group of businessmen in Japan. And on the return flight, a Sunday, Brian got the message that the wife of one of our members, Stan Darling, MP from Prairie Sound, Muskoka, had passed away, and the funeral was the next day, on Monday. Brian had the pilot divert the flight, and unannounced, he attended the funeral for Stan's wife. And then, Madam Speaker, what I think speaks to a level of humility that is so important in remembering Brian Mulroney's legacy is this. Mr. Malone goes on to say, as Stan was leaving the front rows of the church, he was shocked to see Brian sitting halfway back next to the aisle, because it was unannounced and unexpected that he would be able to make the time to attend that funeral. That personal touch and how impactful that truly was. And I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that it is that impact, that in that personal connection, that allowed the pioneering of things that we take for granted in our nation today, as I referenced things like NAFTA, free trade, an idea that was surprisingly not popular at the time that it was introduced, yet the impact that it has on our nation. But it was that care for people that another story that was shared with me was how before Brian Mulroney had entered politics, he was the chief executive officer of the Iron Ore Corporation. I know that the Conservative leader has referenced this a number of times. One of the stories associated with that work and his time as the chief executive officer, so the boss of the organization, was this, that he was known to carry a lunchbox into the company, that while he was an executive at that company, he wanted to make sure that he could eat lunch with the employees. And it was no surprise that after a fairly short time of that care for the people at that company, Madam Speaker, that labor disputes and productivity rose. That sort of leadership is so very impactful. Madam Speaker, a line of a poem that is very well known and has been referenced over the course of the discussion here this evening and the tributes that were made this past week is Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, If. And one of those lines, Madam Speaker, is, if you can walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. And it is that legacy that I would suggest defines so much of the impact that Brian Mulroney was able to leave on this country. But in the last minute or so that I have, Madam Speaker, I would share something else that is associated, that I had the opportunity to learn about when I was a university student. And that was the boldness to tackle challenges. And specifically, I would reference that although not successful in leading constitutional change, the leadership to be able to take on those issues head on is something that I think is a lesson for us all today. And I would mention in that of course we all know the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord, of which, and I won't get into much of the details here, but the boldness to be able to take the challenges of the nation, try to boil it down to action that could be taken, and then to take that action knowing that you may not well be successful. Things like constitutional reform that would have, in the case of the Charlottetown Accord, brought about significant democratic reform, including changes to Canada's Senate. So, Madam Speaker, I would conclude by saying this. We are remembering much about Brian Mulroney's legacy as the 18th Prime Minister of Canada. But in addition to that, he was a father, he was a husband, he was a grandfather. And I would simply say this to Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, and Nick, and his larger family, including his many grandkids now. I'd like to say thank you to them for sharing their husband, their father, their grandfather with a grateful nation, and acknowledge the leadership that provided in turning Canada into the country that it is today. May he rest in peace, and may God bless his family and give them peace during this time.